2024 flooding in states like Borno and Maiduguri disrupted learning outcomes for 2.2 million children. In what ways do you think climate-induced incidences like flood directly affect learning outcomes in Nigeria?
Flooding disrupts the livelihoods and homes of families. Last year alone, for example, in Jigawa State, over 115 schools were damaged. And once this disruption happens, families will now prioritize survival. Education is not even part of their priorities, it becomes a lower priority because the children will now have to support the families with their economic activities in order for them to survive.
You're welcome to the CSEA Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, we are joined by Martin Ufi, a research associate here at CSEA, and we explore Nigeria's climate education crisis, its challenges, and the possible solutions. You're welcome to the podcast, Mr. Martin Ufi.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so we are diving into the education climate crisis in Nigeria, and despite the promises for compulsory primary education, free compulsory primary education, Nigeria continues to be one of the countries leading in the number of out of school children. The numbers are currently standing at 10.5 million children, and this represents 15% of the global total. So this for me does not just reflect numbers, right? It shows that there's a deep-seated learning problem. There's a deep-seated problem with the educational system in Nigeria where the most vulnerable people are finding it difficult to access learning opportunities. For instance, the 2024 flooding, that's before this year's flooding, the 2024 flooding in states like Borno and Maiduguri disrupted learning outcomes for 2.2 million children. So in what ways do you think that climate-induced incidences like flood directly affect learning outcomes in Nigeria?
Right. So as you mentioned, last year's flooding was devastating, and over 2.2 million people were affected. And the first thing is climate or extreme weather events such as flooding leads to destruction or damage school infrastructure.
Right.
And last year alone, for example, in Jigawa State, over 115 schools were damaged. 115 schools in Jigawa alone. So if you have an average of 500 students in each school, so do the math and you find out the number of schools alone in Jigawa State. Then talk more about Borno and other states that were affected last year. Also this year alone, the Mokwa flood in Niger State has already affected 3 schools and disrupting learning for over 1,200 school children. So the first thing there is infrastructure. Now, once you leave infrastructure, you go back to that's like at the school level, at the household level. Flooding disrupts the livelihoods and homes of families.
Yes.
And once this disruption happens, families will now prioritize survival. So now survival, that means education is not even part of their priorities, it becomes a lower priority because the children will now have to support the families with their economic activities in order for them to survive. So that's at the household level, right? At the community level too, you said even the schools that are even still standing are repurposed as emergency shelters.
Yes.
So those are the issues that climate-induced weather this thing causes.
Those are the direct issues.
Direct issues, yeah.
So infrastructure,
loss of livelihoods, and loss of lives too. And even the existing schools are repurposed as shelters.
Yeah.
And of course, once that is done, there's lower learning opportunity because the schools that were supposed to be open are already repurposed as shelters for people that don't have anywhere to go to.
So I'm glad you mentioned infrastructure, and that feeds into the next question I was going to ask. Beyond infrastructural damages, what are the invisible or less visible effects that climate-induced floods has on education?
Okay, right. So for the pupils or for the school children, the first thing is there is the loss of learning momentum. Because as a result of the flooding, they are traumatized, they are stressed. So learning momentum is out of it. Yeah, drops. So aside that, also for the families, right? As I earlier mentioned, families are looking at survival. So already they are not even thinking of any child going back to school. So everybody has to work in order to be able to survive. Now, aside that, also if you look at still at the family level, now if for those that are even surviving a bit, going back to school, you have to get school uniforms, pay fees, and still leads to survival. So those are now burdens because they cannot pay for their fees. They cannot buy the school uniform.
Like a list of priorities. That happens.
Yeah. So they have to prioritize themselves.
School is
Now at the
out.
school level too, damage in infrastructure, of course, loss of records. So if eventually these children want to re-enroll in other schools, they don't have any records to show that, okay, what was the last class attended, which school did you attend, or whatever like the issues may be, right? So those are the key invincible damages that climate-induced this causes.
I'm glad you mentioned the loss of records, because that's one of the things that feed into the next question I'm going to ask you. Nigeria already suffers from an education poverty. About 75% of children cannot read by age 10. So how do you think these floods are affecting education or amplify the problem that we currently have?
Okay, so it's very simple, right? If let's take urban and rural settings, for example. Now, flooding escalates or widens the inequality gap. Richer environments, urban environments adapt faster.
Right.
Now, rural areas lag behind. And what's the result? Children who were already lagging behind are further left behind. Right, because of they cannot. So that is just a simple thing there. Because, for example, now floods happening in cities like Abuja, you can't compare it to places like in there like Mokwa, for example.
Yeah.
So the adaptation level in Abuja will be greater than that of the recent one in what's called Niger State.
Yes.
So now it widens the inequality gap.
All right.
That exists, yeah.
So, given the frequency of these flooding incidences, we had one in 2023, in 2022. That's the one I can remember. 2023, 2024, and now this one in 2025. Yeah. So, should Nigeria be prioritizing building climate adaptable educational structures or mobile classroom in these high risk areas?
Now, the question should be either or. We need both.
All right.
Right, because it's more of like being proactive. Right, we need those climate smart infrastructure, high-rise buildings, climate resilient wash facilities, as water, sanitation and hygiene facilities, and all of that. We also need the mobile classrooms in case of emergencies, because we know, like for example, NIMET has, I think they made recently some flash flood alerts, right? So governments and humanitarian agencies should prepare for those mobile classrooms, mobile learning kits, right? So it shouldn't be either or. Both are needed because we need to prepare ahead of this. These things will happen, so we need to prepare ourselves ahead of time. Yeah. So we need both the climate smart infrastructure and the climate resilient wash facilities, and as well as mobile classrooms and learning kits for alternative for emergency situations. Yeah,
because that enables us to be more, adaptable, flexible in terms of the occurrence of these things. Yeah. So I wanted to ask next, what should be the role that international partnerships play in helping or seeking to help Nigeria solve these problems? Should it just be aid focused, or is there any other way that international organizations can come in?
Now, aid is very important because the international organizations like UNICEF, they can come in through funding.
Yes.
Right. Through helping us build strategies to help us adapt and mitigate these issues. For example, now UNICEF, however, there is always the funding gap, even in aid. This year, UNICEF set out to raise $7.4 million to help out in school children in climate this year. However, currently, I think only $700,000 has been raised. Wow. So that's about 91% funding gap. That's UNICEF alone. So even if we want to rely on aid, the funding gap is there. Right. So now UNICEF can come in by tailoring measures based on our own, listening to the local communities, tailoring solutions based on our own priorities here. Also, UNICEF can also help Nigeria by helping us adapt to lessons from other countries, other flood-prone countries. Okay, what happened? How did they go about it? They can also, since they are the ones there, they can also bring those solutions back to Nigeria. Okay, this is how this was averted, or this was controlled, or this was mitigated in other climes. So this is how you can adapt to it. Yeah. So aside funding, they can help to also train teachers on education in emergencies, EIE, that's what it's called. So they have the expertise, they bring the expertise to train our teachers on education in emergencies also.
Yeah, and I think it's important, like you said, that they help train teachers because it helps them show us the infrastructure side of improvement and the non-infrastructural side of improvements that are needed. So the next question I had is, how can disaster preparedness, the plans for disaster preparedness, better integrate education continuity? So for example, like you already mentioned, there's need for emergency schools, mobile classrooms. So are there other examples that are part of disaster preparedness in terms of combating this problem?
So basically, there's what UNICEF has this education is in a box kit.
Education in the box.
Education in a box kit.
Okay.
Now, it's an emergency kit that has supplies and materials for one teacher and 40 students. And it's used, it comes in handy when within 72 hours of flooding, if schools are damaged now, within 72 hours, students can actually go back to learning using that education in the box kit. So if we stockpile our schools with those kits, particularly in areas prone to flooding, stockpile the schools with those kits, train, like I mentioned earlier, train teachers on how, it's not just about stockpiling the schools with these kits. Do the teachers know how to use these kits? So we need to train them.
Training is important.
We also need to train the children on how, because they only got used to classroom learning. We need to teach these children how to on education, alternative education programming, right? Where do they listen to radio? What time do they? Because most people, radio is just for news. So what if they are using the radios to teach you what they're supposed to teach you in the classrooms, right? So all these have to be integrated into the education preparedness.
All right. So what do you think is the action that policymakers, non-governmental organizations and government particularly can take to support climate education access? Okay,
so policymakers can fund buildings, the building of climate smart schools, climate resilient wash facilities, right? NGOs and other international organizations can help design and also fund the building of these. Communities themselves have a role to play because they help maintain these facilities. But it's not just about building the facility. Communities themselves have a role to play in order to be able to maintain these facilities, right? The individuals also must also use, if you don't use the facilities, then it's of no use being there. So those are the roles each one has to play. The policymakers, how do we increase funding? And policymakers don't have to wait until the event has happened. They have to be proactive, not reactive, right? So before then, we know, this will happen. Then what are we doing to support when it happens, to mitigate or make people adapt? Because it's not about mitigation again. It's about how to adapt. So how do you adapt to this? So that's how you provide funding for this. In as much as international organizations can also partner with you. When international organizations have the role to play in designing, right, this maybe the structures or the systems and all of that, then like I said, communities also help to maintain those facilities there.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin, for joining us on this episode of the CSEA Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the CSEA Podcast. We hope you found it as valuable as we did. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. See you next time.